There is a version of the past that gets repeated constantly and turns out to be almost entirely made up. In this version, ancient humans rose with the sun. They went to bed when it got dark. They slept a clean, solid 8 hours, unbroken, in perfect alignment with nature. Then civilization came along with its artificial light and its screens and its alarm clocks and wrecked something that had worked flawlessly for hundreds of thousands of years. It is a comforting story. It is also, in most of its specifics, wrong. Ancient humans did not wake up at 5 a.m. They also did not wake up at 6, or 7, or any other number. And the reason is simpler and stranger than it sounds. That question cannot be answered because the thing it asks about did not exist. Let's dig into this properly because unpacking why requires taking apart 3 separate assumptions, and all 3 fail. First, a note on what we can actually know, because this is a topic where confident claims outrun the evidence constantly. Sleep leaves no fossils. There is no archaeological signature of what time somebody woke up 30,000 years ago. Everything we say about ancient sleep comes from 3 indirect sources. The biology of living humans, which we assume has not changed dramatically. Written records from pre-industrial societies, which only cover the last few thousand years and only some places. And studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer and horticultural groups. That third source needs a serious caveat. Communities like the Hadza in Tanzania, the San in southern Africa, or the Tsimane in Bolivia are not living fossils, and it is a mistake to treat them that way. They are modern people with their own long histories, adapting to their own circumstances, frequently in contact with outside economies. What they offer is a look at how human sleep behaves without electric light and industrial schedules, which is useful and considerably more limited than "this is how our ancestors slept." Also worth flagging, this question is about anatomically modern humans and the recent pre-industrial past, not about the whole hominin lineage. What Homo erectus was doing at night is essentially unknowable. With that established, the first assumption to dismantle is the easiest. 5 in the morning is a clock time, and clocks are an extraordinarily recent technology. For nearly all of human existence, there was no such thing as 5 o'clock. There was no number attached to any moment of the day. There was light, dark, dawn, dusk, high sun, the position of stars, and the behavior of animals. Even after mechanical clocks appeared in medieval Europe, time was not standardized. Every town kept its own local time based on when the sun crossed overhead there, which meant noon in one town differed from noon in a town 40 miles away. Nobody cared, because nobody needed to coordinate that precisely. Standardized time is a product of railways. Trains crossing many towns made local time unworkable, since a timetable is meaningless if every station measures time differently. Time zones were adopted through the late 19th century primarily to solve that scheduling problem. And the clock time on your phone descends directly from that. So an ancient human waking at 5 a.m. is a category error. There was no 5. There was only the sky. Let's talk about the biology underneath all of this too, because this represents the part that has not changed even while everything around it has. Nearly every cell in your body runs on an internal clock. There is a master timekeeper in the brain, a small cluster of cells in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it maintains a rhythm of roughly 24 hours even in complete isolation from external cues. Experiments placing people in environments with no light changes and no time signals found that their sleep and waking continued cycling on a period close to, but not exactly 24 hours, drifting slightly each day. That drift is the important part. An internal clock that runs slightly off needs to be reset daily, and light is the primary signal that does the resetting. Specialized cells in the retina, separate from the ones used for vision, are particularly sensitive to blue wavelengths and feed directly to the master clock. Morning light pulls the rhythm earlier. Evening light pushes it later. Melatonin is the downstream messenger. Production rises in darkness and is suppressed by light, and its rise is closer to a signal that night has begun than to a sedative in itself. Body temperature follows the same rhythm, falling through the night and reaching its low point in the hours before waking, then climbing again. For essentially all of human history, the light signal driving this system came from one source with one schedule. Firelight is warm-toned and dim enough that it interferes relatively little. What changed with electric lighting is the intensity, and the timing. Bright light available at any hour, delivered straight into a system built on the assumption that bright light means day. So the machinery ancient humans were running is the machinery you are running. The inputs are what got rewritten. The second assumption fails on geography. Suppose we translate the question into something meaningful and ask whether ancient humans woke before dawn. The immediate problem is that dawn is not a fixed thing. It depends entirely on where you are and what time of year it is. Near the equator, day length barely varies. Roughly 12 hours of light and 12 of dark all year. Move away from the equator and the variation grows dramatically. In northern Europe, midwinter offers a short window of weak light and a very long night, while midsummer runs the opposite way, with light persisting most of the night. For humans living at high latitudes without artificial light, winter nights were far longer than any reasonable amount of sleep. 14, 15, 16 hours of darkness. You cannot sleep through all of that even if you want to. Something has to happen during those hours, and that brings us to the most interesting finding in this whole area. Let's talk about segmented sleep too, because this represents the single biggest correction to the standard picture. A historian named Roger E. Kirch spent years working through pre-industrial European sources, diaries, court depositions, medical texts, plays, prayer manuals, letters. He found references, hundreds of them, to something modern readers would find bizarre. People describing their first sleep and their second sleep as separate, ordinary, unremarkable things. The pattern he describes goes roughly like this. People went to bed a few hours after dark. They slept for several hours. Then they woke in the middle of the night for an interval of perhaps an hour or more. Then they went back to sleep until morning. The waking period was not treated as insomnia or a problem. It was normal, and people used it. They prayed, since religious guidance existed for exactly this interval. They talked quietly with whoever shared the bed. They tended fires. They interpreted dreams, which were fresh and easily recalled. Some got up to do light tasks. Some had sex, and at least one medical text of the period recommended this timing on the grounds that people were better rested. E. Kirch's argument is that this pattern was widespread across pre-industrial Europe and appears in sources from other regions as well, and that it faded as artificial lighting spread, bedtimes moved later, and the night compressed into a single consolidated block. Some laboratory work has been read as supporting this. In an experiment where participants were given long stretches of darkness each night over an extended period, sleep reportedly reorganized into two blocks separated by a quiet waking interval. There is pushback worth acknowledging. Studies of contemporary equatorial hunter-gatherer groups have generally not found clear biphasic sleep, which some researchers take as evidence that segmentation was a response to long winter nights at high latitudes rather than a universal human default. Others argue Kirch's sources are strong and the pattern was real where nights were long. The most defensible position is that segmented sleep was common under particular conditions rather than being the ancestral human norm everywhere. This detail is worth sitting with directly because of what it implies for a very common modern experience. Waking at 3 in the morning and lying awake for an hour is treated today as a disorder. Middle insomnia, something to be medicated or corrected. Under a different lighting regime and a different set of expectations, the same experience was simply the middle of the night. Language itself preserves traces of the older pattern. Expressions in various European languages referring to a first sleep, a dead sleep, or the hours around the middle of the night appear in contexts that assume the listener knows exactly what is meant and then quietly stop appearing in later periods. Words fall out of use when the thing they describe stops happening, and the disappearance of this vocabulary through the 18th and 19th centuries tracks the spread of lighting and later bedtimes closely enough that several researchers have treated it as supporting evidence. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about what field studies actually found too, because this represents the best evidence available on sleep without electricity. Research teams have used activity monitors on members of several communities living without electric light tracking sleep timing, duration, and temperature exposure across substantial periods. Several results surprised people. Sleep duration was not longer than modern industrial averages. In several of these groups, average nightly sleep came in around 6 to 7 hours, which is at or below what people in wealthy countries typically report. The idea that pre-industrial humans luxuriated in 9 or 10 hours does not survive the data. Sleep onset was not at sunset either. People generally stayed up for a few hours after dark, around fires, talking and telling stories. Firelight is old, control of fire long predates modern humans, and evening social time around it appears to be a deeply established human pattern rather than a modern intrusion. The wake timing produced the most interesting finding. Waking tended to cluster near the coldest part of the night, shortly before sunrise, and the researchers argued that ambient temperature, the daily cycle of cooling and warming, was a stronger driver of sleep timing than light alone. Human core body temperature drops during sleep and rises before waking, and in an environment without heating, the external temperature cycle and the internal one line up closely. So the answer to the original question, translated properly, is that people in these conditions frequently did wake before sunrise. Whether that lands at 5 o'clock depends entirely on latitude and season, which is exactly the point. Let's talk about where people slept too, because this represents another assumption embedded in the question that does not survive contact with the evidence. The modern default, a private bedroom, a dedicated bed, 1 or 2 people in it, is unusual historically, and remains unusual across much of the world today. For most of human history, sleeping was social, and often communal. Whole families shared a single sleeping space. In many pre-industrial households, the bed was among the most valuable objects owned, and was shared accordingly, sometimes including servants, travelers, and guests. Inn beds were routinely shared with strangers. Among mobile foraging groups, people frequently slept in the open or under simple shelters, close together, near a fire that was tended through the night. Surfaces varied enormously: hides, woven mats, leaves, packed earth, raised platforms. The idea that there is a natural sleeping posture, or surface humans are built for, does not hold up well against how many arrangements people have used successfully. That communal setting changes what sleep actually is. Waking briefly to a fire being fed, someone shifting, a child crying, an animal outside, a conversation. This was ordinary and continuous. Sleep under those conditions was not a sealed, silent, uninterrupted block, and the expectation that it should be one is a modern development that arrived alongside private rooms and soundproofed walls. It also affects safety. A person sleeping alone in the open is vulnerable. A person sleeping in a group with a fire and staggered wake times is considerably less so, which connects directly to the next piece. Let's talk about who was awake when too, because this represents a seriously elegant piece of the puzzle. Researchers studying the Hadza tracked sleep across a group over an extended period, and found something notable. Individuals varied substantially in their sleep timing. Older members tended to go to bed earlier and wake earlier. Younger members went to bed later and slept later. The result was that across the whole group, there was almost no time at which everybody was asleep simultaneously, reportedly only a handful of minutes across hundreds of hours of observation. The proposed explanation is called the sentinel hypothesis. A group sleeping in the open, exposed to predators and other threats, benefits enormously from having somebody awake at all times. Rather than organizing formal watch shifts, a group with naturally staggered sleep timing gets continuous coverage for free. If that is right, then variation in chronotype, the difference between people who naturally wake early and people who naturally stay up late, may not be a defect in either direction. It may be an adaptive feature of groups, with the mismatch between individuals being the whole point. That reframes a familiar modern annoyance. The teenager who cannot get up in the morning is displaying a well-documented shift toward later timing during adolescence that appears across cultures. In a group sleeping outdoors, having your least experienced but most alert members awake late is a reasonable arrangement. In a system that starts school at 8 in the morning, it becomes a problem. Let's talk about daytime sleep too, because this represents a piece the 8 consolidated hours model leaves out entirely. Napping is widespread, old, and in many climates practical rather than indulgent. In hot regions, the middle of the day is the worst time to be doing physical work outdoors, and a rest through the peak heat with activity resumed in the cooler afternoon is a sensible arrangement rather than a lapse in discipline. Versions of this exist across the Mediterranean, South Asia, Latin America, and much of Africa, and they long predate anyone worrying about productivity. There is also a physiological basis. Human alertness dips in the early afternoon, independent of what or whether you have eaten as part of the daily rhythm. That dip is measurable and consistent, which suggests that a two-block pattern across the whole 24 hours may be closer to the human default than a single nocturnal block. Work rhythms varied seasonally too, in ways that flatten out completely under industrial scheduling. Agricultural labor is wildly uneven across the year. Planting and harvest demand enormous effort, while deep winter in temperate regions offers relatively little outdoor work. Long winter nights coincided with the season of least demand, which is part of why extended and segmented sleep was practical, then in a way it would not have been during harvest. The result is that pre-industrial sleep was not one schedule, but a set of arrangements that shifted with season, climate, workload, and age. Fixing all of that into a single repeating pattern was the change, and it came with the factory rather than the light bulb. Let's talk about where the early rising ideal came from, too, because this represents the actual origin of the thing the question assumes. Rising before dawn as a moral virtue has traceable sources, and they are institutional rather than natural. Monastic life is one. Christian monastic communities structured the day around fixed prayer offices, including services in the deep night and before dawn. Bells governed the schedule, and monks rose in darkness because the rule required it. Similar practices exist in other religious traditions with early devotional obligations. These communities were among the first to impose precise scheduled waking on people, and they did it for spiritual reasons rather than natural ones. Industrial work is the other and larger source. Factories required large numbers of people to be in the same place at the same time, and the schedule was set by the machinery rather than the sun. Whistles and bells summoned workers. In some industrial towns, people were employed as knocker-uppers, walking the streets before dawn, tapping on windows with long poles to wake clients who could not afford clocks. That job existed well into the 20th century. The alarm clock and the standardized schedule that followed are recent impositions on a species that spent nearly all its existence waking up whenever the combination of light, temperature, noise, and internal rhythm happened to converge. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. The question assumes something that never existed. There was no clock, so there was no 5 a.m. There was no fixed dawn, because dawn moves with latitude and season. And there was no single universal sleep schedule, because humans spread across nearly every environment on the planet and slept differently in each. What the evidence actually supports is a picture with a few consistent features. People stayed up for a while after dark, socially, usually near fire. Total sleep was not notably longer than ours, and in several documented cases was shorter. Waking often happened before sunrise, tracking the temperature minimum as much as the light. Where nights were long, sleep frequently broke into segments with a calm, waking interval between them that nobody considered a problem. And within any group, individuals were spread across a range of timings rather than synchronized. The thing that changed is not that we started waking up early. Plenty of pre-industrial people woke in darkness. What changed is that waking stopped being a response to conditions and became an obligation to a number. The same number every day, regardless of season, weather, latitude, or how the individual body happened to be running. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. Our ancestors were probably not better rested than we are, and they were not sleeping some perfect natural sleep we have lost. What they had was permission to wake up whenever they woke up, and the thing that took that away was not electricity, but the invention of a schedule that everyone had to share.